Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled that you could all be here with us as we talk about this new report and new research that we have upcoming. We're excited about this research and we're thrilled to be able to share it with everyone. While we're waiting for everybody to file into the room, please chime into the chat. Let us know what organization you're with and what you're hoping to get out of this webinar. We'd love to hear from you and just know who you are out there. So just go ahead and type it into the chat what organization you're with and why you're here, what you're interested in. We'll get started in just a moment once everybody's in the room. Hi, Meg from CLEAResult. Effective virtual home assessments. It's nice to see you, Donovan. With Seal. Enbridge Gas in Ontario, my native land. David Moffat, thanks for joining. And Henry Love is currently launching an assessment program, so it's great. This is going to be very timely for you. We have Corey from NREL, Derek from the California Alternative Energy and Advanced. I missed it. Some of you just love Seth's presentation, so that's nice to see. It's great to see everybody here. I'm going to get started now. Thank you again for joining us on today's webinar, encouraging home upgrades to meeting climate goals through remote assessments. My name is Reuven Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. It's kind of a mouthful, but we just call it ACEEE for short. I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an increase in remote home energy assessments, as I'm sure many of you are aware. But they've proven useful in multiple ways. Not only do they help encourage upgrades, but they're also important for mitigating climate change. They allow assessors to reach more customers quickly and inexpensively. So today, we partner with remote energy assessment provider CLEAResult to discuss how these assessments are effective and how behavioral science insights can make them work even better. We'll highlight a recent ACEEE report that we released in December. It's available on the ACEEE website with an accompanying tips sheet for contractors. So if you want the really quick summary on how to improve remote assessments using behavioral science, go to the tip sheet. Okay, so before I go any further, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the BEC conference. If you're interested in the nexus of behavior, energy, and climate change, do check out the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, or BEC, which happens in November. It's going to be a hybrid conference this year, not a virtual conference. So check that out if you're interested in this type of research. And also, before we get started, some quick housekeeping announcements. So today's webcast will be recorded, and we'll send the recording to all the registrants in the next couple days. It just takes us a little while to edit them and upload them, but you will see them in your inbox shortly. Feel free to use reactions. You might see at the top of your screen a little high-fiving happy face. If you click on that, you can share your reactions while the webinar is ongoing. It's a nice way for us to encourage. Yes, somebody is already giving me a thumbs up. That's how you do it. Thank you. Throughout the entire webinar, use the chat, as you've already seen, to chat amongst yourselves. But also, if you have any questions for the speakers, I'll ask them at the end of the webinar. And finally, if your slides are too small, here's a little hot tip on how to get them bigger. Click on the 3 dots and you can select focus on content. That makes them a tiny bit bigger. And if you want them even bigger than that, you can try full screen mode on those 3-dot menu. So hopefully that helps. And now I'm very excited to introduce our speakers for today. Emma Cooper is a research analyst in the behavior program, as well as the state policy team at ACEEE. And Seth Little is the director of the residential portfolio for CLEAResult. So first up is Emma Cooper. Emma conducts research on the human behavior and also state policy teams at ACEEE. That includes designing and analyzing survey experiments, authoring a chapter on the state scorecard. She's particularly interested in behavior change and decision-making. She joined ACEEE in 2018, working previously at the Alliance to Save Energy on the policy and research teams, and as a consultant as SB Works, assisting small businesses in sustainable business practices. Cooper holds a Master's of Science in Climate Change and Policy from Bard Center for Environmental Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Earth Science and Psychology from DePaul University. And she's also just a wonderful person who I've enjoyed working with for the past year. So Emma, please take it from here.
Thanks, Ruben. Oops. Okay, can you see my slides? Alrighty.
Got 'em.
So,
Looks good.
okay, thanks. So welcome everyone. Thanks for attending the webinar today. I'll be kicking things off today by discussing ACEEE's recent report on remote home energy assessments, give a brief overview of our findings in the report, and then focus on how behavioral research can be applied to increase their effectiveness. So as Ruben mentioned, remote assessments became particularly popular during the pandemic when assessors weren't allowed in people's homes. And we at ACEEE believe remote assessments are, I'm sure we're not alone, that they're an important tool going forward outside of the pandemic, especially in helping the US reach its climate goals. So we were curious and wanted to investigate whether remote assessments are effective and how to increase their effectiveness using behavioral science. And specifically, we were hoping to determine who would be the best candidates for remote assessments and how to encourage the people who get remote assessments to follow through with recommendations provided by the energy assessor. All right, there we go. So we did 4 main things. First, conducted a lit review to determine what programs are currently available, if there have been any studies on best practices, and which behavioral techniques and theories might be most applicable for the assessment process. Second, we interviewed experts, utilities, program administrators on their current remote program offerings, and this provided us with a clearer picture of the similarities and differences between various programs, as well as some of the current benefits and challenges of remote assessments. We directly observed remote assessments. So we coordinated with some programs and some customers and got to actually sit in on and follow along as a remote assessment was conducted. And this gave us a better idea of the process overall and allowed us to figure out where the best places to apply those behavioral science insights might be. And then finally, we collected customer satisfaction data about the remote assessment programs, and this involved getting raw data from some programs, as well as conducting our own survey that looked at both remote and in-person assessments. And so based on all this research and data we gathered, we were able to draw several conclusions about how effective we think they are, who we think would be the best candidates for remote assessments, and how to make these assessments even more effective using behavioral science techniques. And all this information, as we mentioned, is available in the report, which I've also included a link to at the bottom of the screen there. So some key findings from our report. First, remote assessments can be an excellent option when targeted to the right customers. In particular, we found this to be younger, more tech-savvy customers, as they tended to follow through with the recommended upgrades and reported higher overall satisfaction after having a remote assessment, especially compared to older customers, such as those aged 65 and older. In addition, because remote assessments require good Wi-Fi connection throughout the home, as well as often the customer ability to move from room to room. If customers cannot meet such criteria, an in-person assessment might be better suited for them. Second, customers who choose remote assessments are generally satisfied with them and usually complete the follow-up actions. They report finding the process to be convenient, straightforward, and easy, and they say they learned more about their homes. Remote assessments can expand the reach of energy efficiency assessments and help the U.S. reach its retrofit goals. So remote assessments allow for a greater reach of customers, especially some previously hard to reach groups, such as those who weren't comfortable with having the assessor in their home, or people who maybe have busier schedules and have less time to dedicate to the overall process. Fourth, experienced assessors we think may be best suited for conducting remote assessments. One of the challenges that several of the experts we talked to reported about remote assessments is that it's sometimes a bit harder to collect accurate data compared to in-person assessments. The assessor is relying on the customer to show them around and point out issues, and the customer doesn't always pick up on things that the assessor would notice were they in the homes themselves. That being said, a few experts we talked to also mentioned how experienced assessors often know most of what they're going to recommend before they even walk through the door. So having more experienced assessors conduct the remote assessment might be able to help minimize that potential loss of data. Remote assessments are convenient for both customers and assessors, can result in greater customer engagement compared to in-person assessments, and can potentially increase program cost effectiveness. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, customers and assessors, both mentioned how convenient they found the process to be. And our own survey we conducted found that customers who had remote assessments reported significantly higher levels of engagement compared to those who had in-person assessments. In addition, because they are remote, you have fewer transportation demands, while still reaching a larger customer base because you're now including some of those more harder to reach groups. And that can help save programs time and money while still increasing the number of homes assessed. And we think it could be particularly effective if you combine them with in-person assessments, for example, by using a remote assessment as a screening tool to determine what upgrades may be needed, before sending the contractor to the home to verify the information collected and install those upgrades. And a screening could also be helpful in determining if a more specialized type of contractor needs to visit the home. And this last point, which I'm going to focus on later in the presentation, is that behavioral science principles can improve the soft skills necessary for assessors to help boost the conversion rates during remote assessments. So looking at our own customer satisfaction survey, one cool thing about this survey we conducted is that we surveyed customers who'd had remote assessments, but also customers who'd had in-person assessments, which really allowed us to compare the two, how people felt about one compared to the other, how the different aspects of each compare. And so I just wanted to briefly highlight some of our findings from that data. So we surveyed 343 customers from the Tennessee Valley Authority, 227 of which had an in-person assessment, 116 of which had a remote assessment. And we asked them a variety of questions from overall satisfaction with the assessment, how many free items they had installed, likelihood of recommending the assessment to another person, and general likes and dislikes of the process. In terms of overall customer satisfaction with the assessment, customers in both groups reported being highly satisfied with assessments, but customers who received in-person assessments ranked their satisfaction slightly but significantly higher than those who received remote assessments. And this was a difference in rating on a 7-point scale of 6.54 to 6.34. And we thought this may have been due to a self-selection bias. That is, people who had in-person assessments wanted an in-person assessment, whereas those who received remote assessments may have had to have one due to COVID restrictions and assessors not being allowed in the home. So we looked at the data again, focusing just on the time period when restrictions began to ease as vaccines became more widely distributed in the US. And we noticed this difference in overall satisfaction was reduced slightly, becoming borderline significant rather than statistically significant. This suggests that when customers can choose the method of assessment, remote or in person, the difference in satisfaction can be minimized and becomes more level. However, this sub-analysis we did had a small sample size, so more research should be done to verify this finding. I've already talked a little bit about this, but customer engagement and participation, and by that we mean, participating and actually going through the house with the assessor, was rated significantly higher in remote assessments than in-person assessments. And this is important because research has shown that engagement is often a precursor to action and following through with recommendations, which is a point I'll discuss more later on. And then finally, in terms of the follow-up actions themselves, customers tended to install free items and paid upgrades at similar rates in both groups. No significant difference between the two. However, we did find a trend by age of customers. In particular, younger customers trended toward doing more installations and purchasing more recommended upgrades after having a remote assessment than having an in-person assessment, while for older customers, especially those age 65 and older, tended to perform more of those follow-up actions after they had an in-person assessment. And this finding also falls in line with another we found related to overall customer satisfaction and age. So on the left axis here, we have average satisfaction rating out of 7. We have type of assessment across the bottom. These were the various age groups in our data. And what we found is that customers aged 30 to 34 reported being more satisfied with remote assessments than in-person assessments, and customers aged 65 to 74 reported being more satisfied with in-person assessments than remote assessments. So these findings all suggest that older customers may prefer or be better suited for in-person assessments, and younger customers may prefer or be better suited for remote assessments, which is an important element to consider when deciding who to target remote assessments to. Okay, now I'd like to discuss how exactly we could make remote assessments more effective and really maximize the likelihood of converting recommendations into actions using behavioral science tips and tricks. And this information is a combination of evidence-based research in psychology and the observations we did of the actual remote assessments themselves. And as Reuven mentioned again, all these tips are summarized in a tip sheet available for free on the ACEEE website, and I've linked it here in the screen on the slide as well. Okay, so these first two I want to mention, I've already talked about previously, and we think they would work particularly well for remote assessments. So first, again, they're very convenient. This point, again, came up several times in the interviews we had with both the customers and the experts, and as one of the things they noted, liking very much about the assessment was how easy and convenient it was. And this is important because convenience and ease is a cornerstone of many behavioral interventions and is frequently cited as a primary motor of behavior change. You know, the easier something is to do, the more likely you are to do it. Similarly, accessibility is especially useful for remote assessments because it allows for that greater reach of customers, again, those who are uncomfortable having others in their homes or who may not be available during traditional work hours. Again, they lead to greater engagement and more active participation. And this is important because studies have shown that the more visceral an experience is for someone, the greater an impact it has on them. So for example, if someone directly experiences climate change effects, they're more likely to believe it's real. And this element is also particularly relevant to remote assessments because while people may engage during in-person assessments, with remote assessments, they have to engage, you know, because they're responsible for walking the assessor around the home with their phone, their tablet, or whatever. And our customer survey data backs this up, as I mentioned. And this picture here really highlights that direct engagement piece customers get from remote assessments. This is from one of the assessments we've shadowed. And you can see the customer is actually reaching up and touching the air duct where dust builds up if air is leaking, while the assessor is explaining what's happening. So this increased engagement can really help the customer connect to what the assessor is trying to explain to them because they're actually seeing and touching and interacting with the areas in their homes while the assessor is explaining to them what's going on, which can help them better understand why the recommended upgrades are important and therefore increases the chances that the customer follows through with those recommendations later on. So 2 other techniques we picked out in our research are education, information, and use of vivid language. First, providing information and educating others about subjects is often cited as, while not necessarily sufficient, still a critical part of changing behavior. And again, because remote assessments require the customer to be so engaged in the process, assessors really have the opportunity to educate the customer on what's going on in their home and why they should do things certain ways. And this was also something that was frequently highlighted as something customers enjoyed about the assessment. They reported feeling like they learned more about their homes and really appreciated how knowledgeable the assessor was in explaining things to them. And using vivid language such as metaphors can really help the customer understand just what the assessor is trying to explain to them and drive the key points home. It can help them understand the magnitude of their energy issues and visualize elements of energy use that might otherwise be invisible. So, for example, one study we looked at where assessors were trained in these types of techniques, they might have described the house as having a naked attic and saying something like, "It's as if your home is facing winter, not just without an overcoat, but without any clothing at all." And in another assessment we shadowed, the assessor actually described the importance of keeping the house as a sealed bubble, and that any holes from pipes or electric wires, poorly weatherized doors or windows, pop that bubble and let air in or out. So in the study I mentioned where assessors were trained, they might have also added something along the lines of, if you were to add up all the cracks around and under your doors and windows, you'd have the equivalent of a hole the size of a football in your living room wall. And I don't know about you all, but something like that just really helps me visualize just how much energy I might be losing from those cracks under the doors and windows. So using this kind of vivid metaphoric language can really drive a point home to the customer and help them understand what issues they need to focus on and why. Okay, finally, there are a few techniques we noticed that the assessors themselves naturally try to employ to increase the likelihood of customers following through with their recommendations, and which was also reflected in the customer satisfaction data that we collected as something that customers themselves really liked about the assessment. First, empathy and rapport. Showing empathy and building rapport has been shown to increase the persuasiveness and effectiveness of people. So by empathizing and really connecting with the customer, assessors can better persuade the customer to take the necessary steps to reduce energy in their home. Second, personalization. Studies have shown that tailoring energy upgrade suggestions to the intended recipient can increase its effectiveness. So personalizing the energy assessment, providing energy saving tips and tricks that are tailored to what the customer actually has in their home can make it more likely that the customer then follows through with the recommendations. For example, one assessor we shadowed asked what items the customer already had installed, or efficient light bulbs, low flow shower heads, that sort of thing. So they weren't sending items that the customer had no need for and wouldn't install. Some assessors also asked at the beginning of the assessment if the customer had any specific or problem areas they wanted to focus on during the assessment. And then finally, providing explanations. So research shows that providing a reason for a request makes it more likely that the request will be complied with. So explaining not only what they want the customer to do, but also why they want them to do it can help increase the chance that the customer then follows up on what the assessor recommends. And there are several other tips and tricks I didn't mention that are summarized in the tip sheet and of course provided in greater detail in the report itself. But all of these behavioral techniques can help assessors really maximize that likelihood of converting recommendations into actions. So to sum up, how to ensure remote assessments continue to make an impact. First, target the right customers. Target the customers who will benefit the most from remote assessments. Younger customers, more tech-savvy customers, those who are uncomfortable with having others in their homes, who have busier schedules. Make the remote assessment as convenient as possible, both for the assessor and the customer. Engage the customer in the process as much as possible. Take the opportunity to educate the customer about their home, providing explanations for why they should do something and using vivid language and metaphors to really drive the key points home. Personalize the energy assessment so it's relevant to the customer as much as possible, and empathize and develop rapport with the customer. Again, all of this is just a slice of the data we've collected, and you can find more information both in the tip sheet and in the report itself, but the recommendations I've outlined here can help ensure that remote assessments continue to make an impact. And with that, I will hand it back over to Ruben.
Thanks, Emma. That was great, really informative. A lot of great stuff going on in the chat as well. And we'll get to all those discussions and questions at the end of the session after we hear from Seth, but keep them coming. We're excited to hear from you, and you can always thumbs up questions you like. Remember, you can do reactions as folks are talking also, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the session to answer your questions. So I'm now going to turn it over to Seth. Seth leads the residential practice for CLEAResult with a focus on finding and delivering innovations in the utility programs. Thanks for being here, Seth, and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Ruben. Really genuinely appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and really grateful that that our organization was able to add a little value to this study and to kind of the idea of virtual assessments as a whole. So a little bit about us, for those of you who might not know about CLEAResult. So at CLEAResult, our mission statement is simply that we change the way people use energy. And frankly, we do it a lot. And, I don't share that to brag, though this is clearly our brag slide. But I do want to give you a sense for kind of our standing in this conversation. CLEAResult performs something on the order of 250,000 energy visits annually. And many of these visits, in fact, the overwhelming majority, have historically been supported by the savings associated with direct install of lighting measures. The energy efficiency industry almost faces an existential sort of threat with the degradation of lighting savings from shifting baselines and regulation. And so CLEAResult actually began work on virtual assessments in the summer of 2019 as just one way to provide kind of data collection and more importantly, the customer engagement value of an on-site assessment, but with lower cost and more flexibility, to give programs another tool by which we could engage with customers and be more cost effective as baselines shifted and customer expectations evolved. So let's start with a little bit of technology. I think technology is really important, and we absolutely feel that ours helps to differentiate our approach. So CLEAResult has partnered with a company out of Portland called Stream. And Stream has developed an industry-leading augmented reality support connectivity platform that allows CLEAResult energy advisors to connect with customers remotely in real time, right? This is core to the ideas that Emma talked about. But through this, we can make this human connection with customers, and this is how we begin to make that connection. We talk a lot about kind of convenience, choice, and control of the customer. And by using this consistent platform and setting some consistent expectations, we're able to kind of set this technological baseline. But I think the baseline is the key here, because technology is really just table stakes, and it needs to be consistent and understandable to the customer. But all of this is in the service of connecting humans to other humans so that we can help them change the way we use energy. If I had to present on virtual in one slide, it would be this one. And I think that this really kind of sums up the way the experience works in the CLEAResult approach. Early on, when we were doing some early kind of employee and friends and family testing on virtual, we were doing a ride along with an energy advisor in Massachusetts. And that person, was using a metaphor, and he said to the customer, "Oh, don't worry, if you can see it, I can see it." And this phrase really resonated with that customer and kind of became foundational to how we think about and how we communicate on remote assessments. I would suggest that the primary value in any assessment that we do, whether virtual or otherwise, is the connection that we make with the customer. It's the feedback that we get from that customer. It's the relationship that we begin to build with that customer. And it is with this foundation that we are able to apply behavioral science, and that we're able to use and communicate our expertise to help them change the way they use energy. I would go further even and suggest that the least valuable function of any given assessments are the quantifiable diagnostics. And I know that this may not be a popular notion with some of you, but I would suggest that our energy advisors are experts, and that those of you who perform energy assessments or who work with those who do are also experts. Emma mentioned a fact that is absolutely true within CLEAResult as well, which is that most of our seasoned energy advisors generally know about 80% of what they are going to recommend in a home before they ever cross the front door threshold. You can tell without looking at a manometer if a home will benefit from air sealing, or if the ducts need to be sealed, or if we need to do further combustion safety analysis. And you know what? I trust you to make those calls. And I don't think that you need to have the meters at Assessum to do so. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not poo-pooing diagnostics. I think they're a very important tool, but I would challenge us to put them at the point in the workflow where they make sense, which is at installation, right? We can identify what the home needs visually and through the engagement with the customer. And then when we perform major measure installation, let's take our test in and our test out readings for accurate energy calculations. But at assessment, focus on what matters, getting to know your customer. What are they focused on? How can we work together to help them change how they use energy? Because any assessment just isn't about the tech, right? It's about that need to connect with a human being in service of saving energy and addressing climate change, literally one customer at a time. So we've got a lot of customer feedback. I saw a couple questions on engagement, and I think that this top picture here kind of highlights it really well. But the idea here is that the customer is literally holding us in their hand, right? They cannot go sit at the kitchen table and pay bills while our assessor walks through the home and installs widgets. They are with us, and we can absolutely tailor that assessment and what we talk about with the customer based on their feedback in real time. And I think this is absolutely fundamental to the magic of a virtual assessment, right? Every customer goes with us the whole time. Now, of course, there's another side to that coin, which is just more engagement is only more engagement. It's not necessarily better engagement. So we need to be really kind of explicit and focused on how we engage with the customer and how we use that time effectively. When we were starting off, the engagement question was a big one for utility clients. The other was, can we get enough actionable information? And you know what, it is absolutely the case that not everybody is going to want to go into their attic with their smartphone. But again, with, becoming prepped with external resources such as county assessor data, real estate data, Zillow, there's a wealth of available data sets out there. But coming prepared before you even have the assessment, focusing on what's important to the customer, and then the observations of the areas of the home where you can get is absolutely enough to get to actionable next steps for a customer. And that's where we focus. So, there are a ton of lessons here, right? And I think one of my absolute favorites is that, virtual activities are essentially exactly the same as in-person activities, except that they fundamentally are not, right? Like, there are some really interesting kind of social aspects to communicating via video over a live connection, right? And we need to be really explicit. We need to set some really clear expectations about what we need from a customer and what they can expect to us. And then we fundamentally must always follow through on those to have an effective interaction. I think the most notable thing that we have found, over several iterations, over a couple of years now of doing virtual assessments, is mostly that they are effective, right? We are able to generate recommendations at a similar rate to on-site assessments, and then customers are following through with those recommendations also at a fairly similar rate. And I was excited to see in the report that ACEEE's research bears that out as well. But there's an important factor here. We are able to perform more virtual assessments than we can in-person ones with the same staff, right? So we're getting recommendations at a similar rate. We're seeing customers follow through at a similar rate, but we're able to perform a lot more of this work. And I really think that ultimately the kind of industry level magic of virtual is going to be its scalability. At CLEAResult, where we're currently focused on in virtual, is standing up a distributed, decentralized organization of virtual kind of engagement technicians, if you will, that can serve multiple programs across multiple geographies, right? Like, it doesn't matter where you are to perform a virtual assessment, right? You can do them from anywhere, right? We can make better use of assessor schedules, right? We don't need to wait for them to drive from one location to the other. If there's downtime, we can slot in an additional assessment from another program. We can expand hours of availability across time zones without having to get into overtime to better serve our customers and provide them more choice. We can meet seasonal or promotional demand more easily as well through this approach. So I really think that at least our ability to scale and to distribute our resources to get them to customers more effectively is going to be a kind of a key differentiation for us going forward. And in doing so, we can help change the way people use energy and help take further steps towards a clean energy future while also helping to address climate change. And for me personally, anyway, that's fundamental and crucial. As we we begin to wrap up, at least our perspective here, I think that there's an emerging industry best practice around the idea of meeting customers where they are. And again, excited that this kind of seems to be consistent with the report. A virtual assessment isn't going to be the right choice for everyone, and neither is an in-home or an online assessment. We haven't talked a lot about those today, but I think that that's a crucial kind of piece of the continuum of how we can engage with customers and collect data. But as we're designing programs and solutions, what we're really thinking about is, let's do thousands of online audits so we can do hundreds of virtual audits and tens of on-site audits. Or let's do on-site audits where it makes sense and for those people who will benefit the most from them. And let's offer other on-ramps to customers where appropriate, right? But in any case, let's be consistent with our engagement and focus on that customer experience and really meet them where they are. I really selfishly want to close with going a little bit beyond the virtual assessment and just thinking about kind of virtual engagement more broadly. Almost immediately when we launched this offering, it was a lot of fun, frankly. We had a lot of utility customers and even, members of program teams within our organization come to us and saying, hey, can I use virtual to do this? Can I use virtual to do this? And it doesn't always work, but overwhelmingly our answer was yes. And just, kind of a couple interesting examples here, but we've got a program in Arizona where we do EV site assessments, and we've got one field team member who frequently pulls in engineering resources from Portland and Chicago to consult on site assessments, literally, through the smartphone and ad hoc and immediately. We're seeing it as a great screening tool. We've got a program in Michigan that does appliance recycling, and a key part of the workflow there is that you have to inspect the unit to make sure that it works. And so for contactless appointments, we're letting the program team use the virtual engagement methodologies to confirm that the unit is running, and then the customer can put the unit outside and we can come pick it up without doing any contact at all. So, again, I think anything where you think about scale and convenience and, speed to engage with customer, I think you're likely to have a good candidate in kind of the virtual realm. And I'm really excited to see where this goes. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share our experience here, and I'm kind of looking forward to some questions.
Seth, that was great. There was a lot of engagement in the chat, a lot of questions. I was especially excited to see folks interacting with each other, making contacts, learning from each other, sharing resources. And so I have maybe if Emma, you could go back online as well. I have a few questions that have come up for both of you. Pardon me, for each of you. Some of them are overlapping, some of them, yeah, much appreciated. So first, I guess there was quite a bit of discussion about, poorly timed sneezes. Emma, there was a lot of discussion about the term engagement, and I think that people are surprised that a remote assessment would be more engaging than an in-person assessment. And for example, Bob asks, he's curious about why would it be more engaging? Donovan Drew says that customer engagement was a big issue for in-person visits for him. So in-person visits had a customer engagement problem. Peter Sunderland also weighed in. So there's opinions on both sides of this. Do you think can you comment on the fact that, or why engagement is, what do you mean by engagement, and why is it more engaging to be remote than in person?
Yeah, so by engagement, I think we mean, actually going about the home and taking part, like if they're in person, following them around and looking at the window, as the assessor's pointing it out, or the water heater, that sort of thing. Is sort of with the remote, it's actually like same thing. But it's actually, there was someone else we were talking to who was surprised that um, you would think, because it's in person, you have the assessor right there, like you could really engage and have a conversation with them. And I think the key piece is that you can be very engaged with in-person assessment, but because the assessor is in the home themselves, like, you don't have to be engaged. With remote assessment, you have to be engaged because the assessor is not going to see the home unless you lead them around it. And so you're automatically, like, seeing the windows, seeing the doors. They have to point it out, looking at the fridge, the coils, because these are things that the assessor would normally check and wouldn't have to get your help to see. So you're seeing things while the assessor is, doing the assessment. I don't know if that helps at all.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're looking for, Emma. And Seth, actually, there's a number of questions for you centered around what do you, well, actually, this is kind of Emma, kind of Seth, but I think Seth, you might be best to answer this. Andrew Price asks, what was pre-outreach data analysis performed to identify homes and customers with the largest efficiency issues, and even ID their specific issues or technology to inform targeted outreach? And Bob similarly asks, what kind of information do you get beforehand? And Sudeep asks this, and Henry Love as well. What do you collect beforehand, and what's the importance of collecting information in advance?
No, it's great group of questions, and I think it's crucial and it's an importance. I will start by saying that we run an incredible variety of programs for a lot of different clients, and there's a lot of variation in between program designs and state regulatory, and so we will never have one consistent design. But I'll give you kind of what I would suggest would be my perceived best practice for this. And I think ideally, if we can match a couple of data sets. I think the gold standard would be something like an Experian data. Emma, you mentioned frequently that particularly younger tech-savvy customers, some Experian data that would give us some demographic, and then gold standard again, give me even just like 30-day reads on meter-based analytics, and let me identify homes with like a kind of a high likelihood to benefit on a kind of an EUI basis. And match those two. If you could then layer on anything like a county assessor data or a Zillow data set or something similar on top, I think that gives us a really fine point of a target to identify those homes and the customers in those homes that are most likely to benefit from the service. And I think that's what I'd like to walk in with. And again, to that point, that like if you give an experienced assessor that information, they're going to know 90% or 95% of what they're likely to recommend before they ever initiate the assessment. And I think this would be true for virtual or any assessment. And then once they actually begin with the engagement and the interaction, they can calibrate that, that 95% based on what they hear from the customer, which I think is ultimately the best source of data for an assessment.
Could I add to that? I think another piece of collecting as much data beforehand as well can really help with making it convenient in terms of remote assessments, but also for in-person, and we could just make it really convenient for the customer, because that's just one less thing they have to worry about, especially if they're already uncertain about what's going on. I need to lead you around the house with my phone. So it's just another way of making it easy on the customer, and while still getting them engaged in the process.
No, that's a great point too, and it goes back to the engagement thing too, right? Because I think that before remote assessments, CLEAResult would have suggested that their average assessment time for a home anyway was probably about 90 minutes. And I think that 90 minutes with a customer having their mobile phone holding up is not a good use of time, right? So like if you can layer data sets, go in prepared, have a good idea of what you're likely to recommend, you know, we're still playing around with this, but like, you know, what is the most effective amount of time? You know, what's the best use of that customer's time? But you can absolutely shrink that way down and be a lot more effective with your time. And then this iterates too, right? Because then, you know, if you can shrink your average appointment time, you can shrink your appointment windows, and you can do more, you know, kind of more engagements with each advisor and, you know, connect with more customers. So crucial.
Absolutely. And so, Emma, just to get back to something that you mentioned with regards to targeting the right people, there's been some chat in the some questions in the chat. Tracy Wallace, for example, says, seems like remote assessments are not a great fit for the lowest income neighbors or communities due to the digital divide and internet access. Henry Love agrees. You know, well, actually, Henry Love suggests that his program, they show up with a tablet and Wi-Fi hotspots to avoid that issue. Zachary Popkin mentions that their program, which is for income eligible in the Philadelphia area, they've seen low demand for virtual as opposed to remote assessments, meaning smartphone, tablet assessments versus an assessment done over the phone without actually having to view the home. Anyways, all three of these folks talk about low income eligibility and internet access divides and problems of that nature. How big of a barrier do you think that is? Is that something that you found, or is there anything else that you can add to this discussion, Emma?
Yeah, no, it's very important discussion to have, I think. I do remember one person we talked to, I think similarly to what Henry said, they would send out an iPad, you know, beforehand and just, you know, try to make it again as easy for the customer as possible. I didn't really see a whole lot in terms of what people were doing to address this. I do remember one person also mentioning how they were trying to create a like less after the fact, gift cards after the fact, you know, or just to like, just because they're aware that it's if you're qualified for low income. But other than that, not a whole lot in terms of like low income versus regular or, you know, middle income. And I think in our TVA data, we didn't see any significant difference in terms of income on any of the effects. I do remember seeing a question in there on like demographics. But yeah, I can't really add much to this conversation because I just didn't gather much data for it. So sorry. Just the things I mentioned.
Thanks, Emma. Seth, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk to you about what is the difference between an in-person or remote assessment. So I know that in helping to write this report, we found that quite a number of programs actually do equivalent, or what they call equivalent remote and in-person assessments. Some folks like John, Adam Wright, they talk about, you know, DOE, or sometimes there's a requirement for certain tests. Are they fulfilled by remote assessments? Could you talk a little bit about what the differences are and whether you're seeing that remote assessments are in any way inadequate or not meeting needs?
Maybe let's go back to front, right? So I think that the best offering is going to be that continuum, right? There will always be things we won't be able to do with virtual, but I do think that one of our interesting findings is that we can do far more than we thought we would be able to do. And I think really that bright line difference really breaks it at the diagnostics, right? Like it is difficult to take quantifiable readings versus, you know, via a visual inspection. But again, you know, the neat thing is that we don't necessarily need to do that at assessment. right? Like, the assessor can identify those recommendations, and then we can gather that data later. Again, we have a wide range of offerings and a wide range of specifications associated with different program designs. But I think that we're finding that, we tend to spend about 45 minutes with a customer on average at least for a residential assessment. There's, in C&I, there's a whole other ballgame. There's a much wider range, but, and that in that time, we're able to take what we already know, what we can divine from a quick look at the home and from that connection with the customer, and turn that into a really actionable set of information. And I think, and obviously, my bias is clear here, but I think that really the quality of the connection, of our expert with another human being, and the foundation that builds for actionable measure recommendations is the magic here. And I think that when you look at that metric, that our results across virtual and on-site are really similar. And then you get to add the layer that with the same resources, the same expertise, we can do a lot more interactions within virtual than we ever could on-site. And then we still have on-site, right? And then if we find something in virtual that's a concern, or that's an opportunity that we need to get some diagnostics on, well, let's roll a truck. We've got the truck, right? Like, this is not going to replace anything. All we're saying is that this is here to stay. But I think on-site is here to stay. I think online is here to stay, right? It's all just adding tools for our program teams.
And actually, I also wanted to ask the same question to Emma to some degree. Was there a Tom Burkout? Hi, Tom. It's nice to see you from Victoria. I think I haven't seen you in ages. Tom asked, was there any difference in the TVA survey that we conducted between remote and in-person assessments?
Yeah, I think the only difference was that the in-person had a blower door test. I remember we were talking when we were coordinating with the TVA folks, that they really didn't want to lose anything between transitioning to the remote assessment. They really wanted to make sure their customers were getting the same level of assessment. So the blower door test you can't really do remotely. So that was the only difference between the two, besides being remote and in person.
Seth, there's a couple of questions that came in, just like pretty nuts and bolts. Nat Pavlinsky asks, how is the customer checking exterior walls for insulation levels? Matt Greeno, also hello, Victoria, says, he asks since you mentioned a measurement device was an anemometer. I'm very bad at pronouncing things, sorry. So just if you could just get those out of the way.
Yeah, sure. So, it is frequently the case that even in an on-site assessment, you're not going to get an accurate reading on wall insulation, right? You're going to get a good guess. If you've got that IR gun, you can definitely get a good sense for what's in there, but you're not going to get an R value, and you're not going to get a specific spec. So again, I think we're leaning on the expertise of our energy advisors and feedback that we get from the customer to get us to an actionable sense. I think and then you could go down that rabbit hole, right? But like, even if you do identify a wall insulation opportunity, how many of those customers go forward? I think if you get a customer who engages on that, that's an excellent opportunity to move to an on-site and maybe to get better numbers. Or again, like, it happens so infrequently. Let's take a piece of siding off and let's really take a look if the customer is going to be that interested in that sort of measure. But let's meet customers where they are. Yeah, and then I think ultimately I was referencing that blower door number, that we would take ideally at installation or at performance of air sealing measures, instead of as an early diagnostic to confirm opportunity.
I noticed some nice comments here from Henry Love and Donovan Drew about how Henry Love says that they're providing IAQ sensors, I believe that's internal air quality sensors, to help them see IAQ impacts from gas stove, which is interesting. And Donovan says that living in northern states, customers will already know if they have poorly insulated walls or not, which is interesting. So there's so much happening here. Let me see if I can come. So Emma, there was a quick question here about who was getting there was two questions from Jacinta and Zachary Popkin about um, who are the people that were surveyed? Do we have demographic data available with regards to the people in the TVA survey? And in particular about income level and satisfaction. Actually, Michael Blaine is kind of related, asks, if the younger group may have been less experienced with home ownership and then versus the older group, and maybe that had some uh, bearing on why in-person versus remote assessments were different. Emma, can you comment on any of the demographics that are available? And, if something, did we find anything that could explain this difference, in ages or differences among demographics?
Yeah, so we collected demographics, gender, age, obviously, income, education, I think even urban and rural. And age was the only one we really saw any significant kind of difference in terms of overall satisfaction, any of the questions we were curious about. Let's see. We did try and do an analysis on the urban rural, but we didn't have enough participants, or the sample sizes were too small. So I definitely think that would be an interesting thing to look for it in the future. Oh, and then with the question about younger customers being less inexperienced, that is entirely a possibility. I think we were curious about why that might be. We didn't have any data to really explore we did look at the likes and dislikes and what reasons why, because one of the things we asked was what items did you install? If you did or didn't install an item, why didn't you install it? And often the people who didn't install an item said they already had it, so they didn't need it. So it's just sitting in a closet somewhere. And so when we looked at just that age group of younger participants who'd had remote assessments and didn't install items, that kind of seemed to be the general theme. But other than that, we didn't really have data, couldn't really find a specific reason why younger customers may prefer remote assessments more to in-person assessments. So I think that's entirely a real possibility.
Thanks. And the last question, I guess, we'll see how many questions we have time for, but there's only 4 minutes left. Seth, there's a question came from Jen Zaro. How do you train your staff to do these remote assessments?
It's a great question. So, and there was, I think there have been a couple comments to this effect as well, right? So I think that when you look at the kind of continuum of assessments, there's way more that is the same than is different, right? So we start with a baseline of a group of energy advisors who are well trained on building science. Most are BPI certified to one extent or the other, usually building analyst. And then we layer on, what ultimately is more behavioral and kind of sociological training than it is anything else. We spend a few minutes on the technology as we start training. And then it's all about, there's this silly line that is customers can hear a smile. And so we're in a lot of that sort of territory, right? But, that's when we talk about, setting clear expectations and following through, being pleasant, stopping to listen to your customers, giving them the space to share what's important to them. But again, we're layering on top of building science this interaction, this way, it is just a hair stilted, right? I don't know about you guys, but before February of 2019, I'd probably been on a handful of video calls. And now I would suggest that maybe 60% of the meetings that I'm on in any given day are video. It took a while to get used to that, right? And little lags, or how you help a customer through a hiccup in Wi-Fi, or even setting expectations on battery life for your phone. This is the sort of stuff that we're layering on top of kind of standard energy advisor training.
That's great. And I guess the last question to both of you is just where do you see this going in the future? What do you want to, maybe Emma, what research do you want to see in the future? And Seth, what programs do you want to see in the future? What is your vision going forward? And then we'll wrap it up. maybe quickly if you can.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think they would be really useful combining them with in-person assessments. Like Seth mentioned, remote assessments are just another toolkit. I think they're both going to stay, but I think both of them each have an important piece to bring to, just getting assessments on the table and homes upgraded. I think I would be really interested to see, because we didn't have enough customers for it, that urban rural comparison between how how they feel about remote assessments versus in-person assessments, and especially with rural people being so remote. And if they prefer remote assessments, that would really save on transportation demands for getting contractors out to the houses. But we didn't have enough data to analyze that, so that's something I'm really curious about.
Yeah, and for me, I think the really exciting stuff, I alluded to this, but it's essentially just in scale and in decentralizing our resources, right? Like, I would like to get this approach into the hands of as many people as I can. And we're actually working even on a technical integration with our call center, such that, we can have a customer call in with an energy related concern. And if appropriate, we just toggle over to the, if you can see it, I can see it. And then we can use that visual aid to help a customer through. And I think, just adding this resource and making it freely available to all is really where we're going to begin to see the impact at scale for virtual. And that's what I'm excited about.
And on that note, thank you, Seth. Thank you, Emma. This has been really wonderful, informative. There's so many questions and comments. We just couldn't reach everybody, but I would encourage you to reach out directly to myself or Emma. Seth, I think you provided I'm not sure if you provided your contact info, but feel free to put it in the chat if you feel inclined. And we look forward to hearing from you all shortly. Be sure to check out the Beck Conference if you want more of this kind of information. You can download the report at the ACEEE website. And of course, you can go to the CLEAResult website for more information on Seth's programs. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next webinar.